Welcome to your second video of chapter 15. In this section, we're going to talk all about the rocky shores and how the organisms in the benthic community adapt to those conditions that exist. So before we get into that, we're going to talk a little bit about how benthic organisms are actually distributed. So the benthic organisms, again, are the ones that live on or near the ocean floor. So more than 98% of the 250,000 known marine species actually live in or on the ocean floor. So it really makes up a giant part of marine organisms. Typically, they live on the continental shelves, and that's just because they have somewhere nice to live on, and they're also close enough to shore that they can get some nutrients. And we're going to also talk more in the next couple of slides about how their distribution gets affected by surface ocean currents, and also just the conditions of the surface ocean. So this is really one of the main points about how benthic organisms are distributed. So that benthic biomass will actually match surface chlorophyll distribution. So we talked before about phytoplankton and chlorophyll. Areas that have a lot of chlorophyll have a lot of phytoplankton and a lot of productivity. So if you have a lot of stuff living at the surface ocean, there's a lot of nutrients, dead organisms, and fecal matter that actually can sink through the water column to the deep ocean floor, and that's what a lot of those organisms actually live off of. So they live off of that detritus, which is that dead or decaying matter that rains down from the surface oceans. So the more organisms you have at the surface, the more you're going to have at the bottom, because they just have that food source. So now we're actually going to start to talk about the communities that exist on the rocky shores. So to do that, first we're going to talk about something called epifauna. So epifauna are the marine organisms that live on the surface of the ocean floor. So they're pretty much permanently attached to the bottom, or they move over it. So some examples are algae. Algae are permanently attached to the bottom. And then crabs are the example of organisms that move over the seafloor. So the diversity of species on the rocky shores varies widely. They have a moderate diversity in these ecosystems compared to other benthic environments. The greatest diversity that we see is in those lower tropical latitudes. The greatest diversity of algae is in the middle latitudes, and that all has to do with nutrients. So when we're talking about rocky shores, we actually break them down into a couple different zones. And when we do that, we're talking about something called intertidal zonation. So most shorelines will actually have this intertidal zonation. And what that is it's a natural organization of ecosystems that happen relative to the sea level because of different environmental conditions. So basically, to put that into more simple terms, you're going to have organisms in an area because either they're used to low tides or high tides, being covered with water or being exposed to air. So a typical rocky shore, we divide it into the spray zone and then 3 intertidal zones. So the spray zone is the area above the spring high tide line. So this area is only covered by water during storms. So it's above high tide, above your highest high tide. So typically the only way you're going to see water there is if you have a really bad storm. Then our intertidal zones lie between the high and low tide extremes and get separated into 3 subzones: the high tide zone, middle tide zone, and low tide zone. And once you see it and I kind of describe it to you, you'll understand why they're high, middle, and low. So the high tide zone is relatively dry, and that's because it's only covered by the highest high tides. So when you have a really high tide, it gets covered by water. Other than that, it's dry. The middle tide zone gets alternately covered by all high tides and exposed during all low tides. So it's kind of the middle. When high tides are there, it's covered by water, but when there's a low tide, it's exposed to air. And the last is a low tide zone, which is normally covered by water, and it's only exposed during extremely low tides. So this kind of shows you those zones to give you a better idea. So the spray zone, again, it's pretty much dry. The high tide zone, it's exposed during low high tides, but covered during the highest. The middle tide zone is between the lowest high tide and the highest low tide. And the low tide zone is pretty much always covered by water. It's between the lowest low tide and then the highest low tide. So this is really a really good summary image because it tells you each zone of the rocky shores gives you examples of organisms, and also tells you what they have to overcome. So what is the hardships of living in this environment? So these are actually going to be really important, and there's some exam questions about in these areas, what do they have to overcome or adapt to? So this is a good summary slide for that. So the organisms that live within these intertidal zones have a lot of different conditions to adapt to. So they have those different environmental conditions or stressors, and each one has some different characteristics between each one of those zones. So we're going to talk about each zone kind of independently so that you get a better idea. And we're going to start with the spray zone. So remember, the spray zone is the one above the highest high tides and is continually exposed above sea level. So the spray zone is also known as the supertidal zone. And the biggest challenge here is drying out. So a lot of these animals have shells to try to help avoid drying out. So they have soft bodies that actually can retain the water, and the shell kind of helps them keep that water in instead of the water leaving their bodies. So some examples of animals you'd see here are snails, a few different species of marine algae, and even a sea roach. Now in the high tide zone, remember, sometimes they're covered with water, but only during the highest high tide. So again, these animals have shells to help them avoid drying out, the same way they do in the spray zone. So for that part for the exam, you need to know that organisms living in the high water portion cannot tolerate drying out. So remember that for your exam. Also in the high tide zone, we see a lot of marine algae. So we see examples of rockweeds with really thick cell walls, because those thick cell walls will help them retain that moisture. And then we also see sessile animals. So sessile animals are just animals that attach to the bottom, like barnacles and mussels. And these are important because they actually attach to the bottom. So they have attachment threads or feet, depending on the organism. And that's important because it actually helps them adapt to strong wave activity. So when those high tides are coming in or big waves, they're attached to the bottom, so they're not going to be pulled away. So for the exam, know that animals with feet have attachment threads that help them adapt to the strong wave activity. So some examples of animals that we see in this high tide zone are barnacles, rockweeds, and sessile animals. Now in the middle tide zone, we see more soft-bodied animals that live here and marine algae. So since there's constantly seawater, we can see those soft-bodied animals that don't have that shell because they're constantly covered by water. So the total biomass of the middle tide zone is greater than the high tide zone, but there's also a lot more competition for rock space. So some of the organisms that we see are mussels and gooseneck barnacles. We also see some marine algae, those soft-bodied animals, carnivorous snails and starfish, hermit crabs, sea urchins, and one we've talked about a lot, and we're going to talk about one more time, are sea anemones. So the sea anemones actually attach to rock surfaces, and they get covered with stinging needle-like cells called nematocysts, and they actually help them poison their prey. So what these stinging cells do is they help them adapt to predators. So nobody's going to try to eat that anemone or invade its space because they know they're going to get stung. So for the exam, know that the stinging cells of the anemone help it adapt to predators. Then finally, the low tide zone. Here we see a lot of algae and surf grasses. A lot of animals actually get hidden by those seaweed and seagrasses. And we mainly see a lot of shore crabs. So shore crabs are scavengers, so they help keep the shore clean. A lot of times they hide in rock cracks during the day, and then they come out at night and feed on the algae. And they have that hard exoskeleton to prevent them from drying out. So this is kind of another summary slide of intertidal zonation. You can see the different zones. So remember, supratidal is just the spray zone, the 3 intertidal zones here, and also some common organisms that you would see. Remember, those species kind of differ from zone to zone. And then towards the top, your diversity decreases. You have more diversity towards the middle and low tide zones. So this wraps up this section. We talked all about the rocky shores, their organisms, and their adaptations that they have in order to survive. In the next video, we're going to talk about sandy shores and their organisms and how they survive. And we're also going to talk about corals and the special conditions that they need.